Alright, it's time for another teamwork build. I haven't done one of these in a while, so let's just get into it. So I designed this build for players that want to play a summoner type class, but don't want to just focus on maintaining summons. Conjuration magic can do a lot more than that. But this build is also designed for players who want to fight in melee right beside their summons without playing the summoner class. But since we are playing a wizard in this build, we're going to have to take a lot of feats to help us with our defense. So there won't be quite as many teamwork options as I normally do in these videos. But before you guys judge me in the comments, I want to let you know that Monkey King is just a name for this build. I did not base this build off of the Monkey King from popular culture. In fact, I didn't even do research on that. So any similarities between this build and the Monkey King from popular culture are completely coincidental. Now that that's out of the way, we can move on to our School of Magic. And we are, of course, going to go for conjuration. We are going to have summons in this build. However, we are definitely going to use the conjuration school's access to spells that create difficult terrain and allow us to teleport. So keep this in mind. The conjuration school will give us access to the augment summoning focus spell. This will allow us to give some of our summoned creatures a +1 to all their checks and DCs, including their AC and attack rolls. Very handy. Then, of course, we gotta pick up an arcane thesis, and we're gonna go with Staff Nexus. So we begin play with a makeshift staff that has 2 spells from our spellbook, a cantrip and a first level spell. This staff gains no charges during daily preparations. We have to spend spell slots in order to give it charges. However, one of the upsides to this is that we can craft the staff into any type of staff we want for the staff's normal cost. This is going to be very important later on. And we do still gain the cantrip and the first level spell with this new staff. At 8th level, we can expend 2 spell slots in order to give the staff even more charges. And at 16th, we can expend 3 spell slots in this way. Then, of course, we gotta pick our ancestry. And we can't really be a Monkey King without being a monkey, so we're gonna go with the brand new Vanara ancestry from Impossible Lands. For our heritage, we're gonna go with, and I really hope I'm pronouncing this right, the Ragdayan Vanara. This will give us a divine cantrip as long as it doesn't do direct harm. And of course, the cantrip we want to pick up here is Forbidding Ward. This will be fantastic for us against boss fights, and we can use it on other party members if they need it. For the background for this build, I went with Eidolon Contact for 2 reasons. The first is that boost to Constitution, because we are definitely going to need that as we level up. The second thing is the Dubious Knowledge skill feats. With this build, it's going to be very important to summon the right creature in the right situations. And knowing about what the party is facing is going to help a lot with that. Thus, getting some true information, even on a failure, is going to be great for this build. The starting stats for this build should be Strength 14, Dexterity 14, Constitution 12, Intelligence 16, Wisdom 12, and Charisma 10. Alright, at level 1, the only feat we get is our Ancestry feat since we're a spellcaster. And for this build, I've chosen Vanara Weapon Familiarity. This is going to give us access to and proficiency with the bow staff. We want to use our staff as a weapon in this build. And the bow staff gives us a few things that a regular staff wouldn't. First of all, it is a reach weapon, which means we don't have to be right up next to an enemy in order to hit them with our staff. The second thing that it gives us is the trip trait. This allows us to gain an item bonus on our trip attempts when we're in melee combat. And finally, it has the parry trait, meaning we can gain a little extra defense if we have an action to position it defensively. For spells of this level, the first one I recommend for a cantrip is Warp Step. For 2 actions, we can gain a 5-foot status penalty to our speed until the end of our turn. We then get to stride twice. This allows us to sprint right into melee combat or right out of melee combat if we need to. And we still have an action to strike or cast a one-action spell. For a first level spell I'd recommend for this build, I highly recommend Mage Armor. We're a wizard who wants to go into melee combat. That means we are definitely going to need item bonuses to AC. And since Mage Armor lasts all day, we only have to cast it once unless somebody dispels it. But come on, that never happens in Pathfinder 2e. You are going to want some summon spells for this build as well, but I'm not going to talk about them because they all work basically the same, just with stronger creatures. No, I think I'm going to focus on conjuration spells that aren't summon spells. With the exception of a couple, but that's just because the best conjuration spells at high levels are summon spells. Alright, for level 2, we're going to start with Cantrip Expansion. Cantrips are where most of our spell damage is going to come from, at least in the beginning. But we're also going to need spells like Warp Step and other cantrips that are going to help out of combat. So 2 extra cantrips per day is something this build sorely needs. Then of course, like all my videos, I'm using the free archetype. So our first archetype for this build is going to be the Rogue archetype. No, we aren't going to be sneak attacking our foes. But what we will gain from the Rogue archetype is some extra defense, which this build desperately needs. Moving on to level 3, I'm going to go over the general feats now that you want to take for this build. Of course, like all my builds, I usually take Toughness, Die Hard, and Canny Acumen for our lowest save, which for this one is going to be Fortitude. For the other two, I've gone with Fleet and Adopted Ancestry for the Dwarf Ancestry. You can take these in any order you want, but you need to take Adopted Ancestry before level 9. We'll talk about why when we get to that point. I would also take Toughness as quickly as possible because we're going to need the extra hit points. Also at this level, we do get access to second level spells. And the spell I recommend here is Web. This creates a 10-foot burst of sticky webbing. Each square can be cleared with 5 points of slashing damage or 1 fire damage. The square has an AC of 5 and automatically fails all its saving throws. However, each time a creature within the web tries to do a move action, they must make either an athletics check or a reflex saving throw. On a critical success, they just break out of the web and don't take a speed penalty. It also clears the web from a square if it used an athletics check. On a success, the target is unaffected during its action, and it clears the webbing from any square it leaves during this action. However, if it fails, it takes a minus 10-foot circumstance penalty to its speed until the start of its next turn. If the target critically fails, it is immobilized for 1 round, and then takes the minus 10-foot circumstance penalty to its speeds for 1 round after that. It can make an escape check to remove the immobilized condition. However, anytime you can force an enemy to waste an action getting out of something is always very effective. Because if they're trying to get out of something, then they're not attacking you. Moving on to level 4, I've gone with Bespell Weapon. As a free action, if our last action was to cast a spell, then we can add 1d6 damage of a type associated with the type of magic we just cast to our weapon strikes until the end of our turn. It's different types of damage for different schools of magic. However, we're going to be casting conjuration magic a lot, so it's probably going to be bludgeoning damage the same as our staff. This is just a little extra damage. There really isn't a better feat to take here, and we do want to do some damage in melee. Then on the free archetype side this level, we will take one of the most important feats in this build, Mobility. As long as we move only half our speed, our strides don't trigger reactions. This is going to be very important for when we need to duck out of certain situations. And keep in mind, this does work with the Warp Step cantrip. We just have to move half our speed during our first stride of that spell. Okay, now we come to ability score increases. For level 5, 10, and 15, we want to increase our strength, dexterity, constitution, and intelligence. Then, for our ancestry feat at level 5, we want to take skillful climber. Come on, we're a monkey. Of course we should be able to climb. And this will give us a climb speed of 10 feet. Thus, we can be up a tree or something and attack using reach, while enemies below us might not be able to hit us. And finally, for this level, it's time to recommend a 3rd level spell. And I recommend Magical Fetters. You target one creature within 60 feet, and they must make a reflex saving throw. Please note this spell does have the incapacitation trait. On a successful saving throw, the target is Clumsy 1 and takes a minus 10 foot status penalty to its speeds for 1 round. On a failure, they're Clumsy 3 and take a minus 10 foot status penalty to their speed for 1 minute. On a critical failure, the target takes the same effects as failure, but is also slowed 1 for the duration. This spell probably won't work too well on bosses because of that pesky incapacitation trait. However, against other enemies that are giving you trouble, this can slow them down and make them easier to hit, which are both fantastic options for this build. At level 6, it's time for steady spellcasting. So if a reaction would disrupt our spellcasting action, then we can make a DC 15 flat check. And if this check is successful, we don't lose the action. Come on, we're a wizard who goes into melee. Of course we're taking this. This is just good strategy. And for the free archetype at this level, I've got a rare one for you guys, and a brand new one, with Masquerade of Seasoned Stance. For one action, you can choose fire, water, negative, or cold damage. As long as you are in this stance, you gain resistance 5 to that type of damage. For one action, you can re-enter this stance in order to change the resistance granted from this stance. At 12th level, the resistance increases to half your level. This has some great versatility against creatures who like to use elemental damage. But the real reason we're taking this is because it's a prerequisite for our next free archetype feat. At 7th, for 4th level spells, I recommend Blink. For 2 actions, for the next minute, gain resistance 5 to all damage, except force. But force isn't all that common. You can also sustain this spell in order to disappear and then reappear in any square 10 feet away. This square is randomly determined by the GM. This movement does not trigger reactions. At the end of your turn, you disappear and reappear as if you had sustained the spell. So this spell is pretty good for making escapes. Also, if you happen to get the direction that you want, you can use this to teleport between foes and hit them. This spell also makes you very hard to pin down, which is something we want for this build. Moving on to level 8, I've gone with Advanced School Spell. This will give us the Dimensional Steps Focus Spell. With this spell, we can teleport up to 20 feet away as a single action, as long as we teleport to a space that is within our line of sight. And every time we heighten this spell by 1 level, we can increase the teleportation distance by 5 feet. This one is definitely for just straight up getting out of sticky situations, especially against creatures that have reactions, but ones that aren't triggered by manipulate actions or teleportation, which there are definitely monsters out there that have reactions like those. Then it's time for Pirouette, which of course is another rare feat. But if your GM gives you access to Masquerade of Seasoned Stance, he'll probably give you access to this as well. So if we're in Masquerade of Seasoned Stance, and an enemy decides to target us with a strike, we can use a reaction to gain a +2 bonus to AC against that attack. If that attack misses, we can immediately step. However, if the attack still hits, we reduce the damage by half our level, after applying immunities, resistances, and weaknesses. Which we're probably not going to have any of those, but still. Moving on to level 9, for our ancestry feat, we'll want to take the feat that's the reason why we want to be adopted by dwarves. Mountain Stoutness. we get to increase our maximum hit points by our level. And this is cumulative with the toughness feat, which we are definitely taking for this build. Also, with both feats, the DC of our recovery checks is equal to 6 plus our dying value instead of 10 plus our dying value. This of course means we might be able to get back up after going down. Then the cleric can heal us or whatever. Plus with this build, we're going to need as many hit points as we can get. And then of course at this level, we also get 5th level spells. And for the recommendation, I've gone with Black Tentacles. For 3 actions, you can create a 20-foot burst area of tentacles within 120 feet. These tentacles must be placed so that they are adjacent to a flat surface. In other words, they gotta be either next to a wall or on solid ground. Then you can make spell attack rolls against the fortitude DC of each creature in the area. Any creature that you succeed against is grabbed and takes 3d6 bludgeoning damage. Whenever a creature ends their turn in the area, the tentacles attempt to grab anyone that they haven't already grabbed. And those that are grabbed take an additional 1d6 bludgeoning damage. The creature can attempt to escape against your spell DC, or they can try to attack a tentacles, but each tentacle has an AC equal to your spell DC. It is destroyed if it takes 12 or more damage. However, even if a tentacle is destroyed, tentacles continue to grow in the area for the duration of the spell. You can dismiss the spell at any time. This is just an excellent way to keep enemies off you while you're back there casting spells, if that's what you're wanting to do for a given situation. At level 10, I'm going to start with Quickened Casting. For a free action, once per day, if your next action is to cast a cantrip or a spell that is at least 2 levels lower than your highest level spell slot, you can reduce the number of actions it takes to cast that spell by 1, to a minimum of 1 action. This one is just a no-brainer for this build. We're a conjuration wizard, and a lot of conjuration spells take 3 actions. So being able to cast them for 2 actions is pretty good, even if it is just once per day. Then we're finally going to take our second dedication with the Staff Acrobat dedication, since we now have enough dex to actually take this. Actually, we had enough dex at level 5, but we needed to take a few defensive feats from the rogue archetype before we could take this. Anyway, when we high jump, leap, or long jump while wielding our staff, we gain a +2 circumstance bonus to our athletics checks, and we add 5 feet to the distance we can jump horizontally and vertically. You can also shove and trip without a free hand as long as we're wielding our staff. And finally, when we roll a success to balance while wielding our staff, we get a critical success instead. The important part here is that shove and trip without a free hand as long as we're wielding our staff. Our staff already has the trip trait, but it doesn't have the shove trait. And sometimes we might want to shove enemies away, especially with this build. Alright, time for the first teamwork report of this video. So the main strategy here is pretty much going to be the same even at high levels. First, you'll want to go into melee combat against lower level enemies. You know, take out the minions of the boss instead of going after the boss itself in melee. This will allow you to keep the minions from overwhelming other spellcasters in your party that aren't as melee inclined. You know, classes like cloistered clerics, witches, and sorcerers. Or that bow-wielding ranger who needs high dex to hit well. Against bosses, flying enemies, and especially in the beginning, you'll want to hang back and cast spells, because you simply won't have the survivability to go into melee combat until around level 9. That's simply the way it is. But once you hit that level 9, you're gonna be able to start going into melee. Plus, you really won't be able to do what this build wants to do in melee combat until around then anyway. At least not well. But your conjuration spells will still help, especially the spells that slow the enemy down or create difficult terrain. The teleportation spells we'll be taking are mainly to get us out of melee combat when we need to, which is the reason why we want a reach weapon here, because This will allow us to use our teleportation spells without triggering reactions as long as the creature we're going up against doesn't have reach itself, and still be able to hit foes with our reach. But creatures with reach are why spells like Warp Step and Blink are so important. It's also why we're taking mobility. Bottom line here is that at low levels you'll want to cast your conjuration spells to help out the party. But once you reach level 9, you can use your conjuration spells to help you in combat as well. At level 11, for our 6th level spell, I recommend you take Collective Transposition. This is another teleportation spell, and this one is actually pretty good. You can target up to 2 creatures within 30 feet, including yourself. For 2 actions, you can teleport both targets to another space within the area. Each creature must be able to fit into their new space, and unwilling creatures can make a will save to resist the effect. On a critical success, the target can teleport if it wants, but it chooses the destination. On a successful saving throw, the target is unaffected. On a failure, you choose the destination for the target. We mainly want to use this to put classes like fighters, barbarians, and monks in melee combat with an enemy, and put us either in the back if we have low hit points, or in melee combat with a different enemy. We can also use this to teleport an enemy off a cliff or something, but they do get a will save against this. At level 12, it's time for Inspired Stratagem. This is, by far, the best teamwork option that rogues have access to. And since we're a rogue, we can take it. And we're an intelligence-based class, so it makes sense to take this. As long as we spend 10 minutes making a plan with up to 4 allies during daily preparations, we can essentially give each of those allies advantage on an attack roll or skill check once per day. Roll twice and take the better results. An advantage on anything is very rare in Pathfinder 2e, so taking this just makes sense for this belt. And then it's Levering Strike from our Staff Acrobat dedication. For 2 actions, we can make a strike. And as long as we don't critically fail, the target becomes flat-footed and takes a -2 penalty against shove, trip, and tumble through attempts until the start of your next turn. This is great for us, but it's also even better for the rest of our party, especially if we've got a party member that is built around tumble through, shove, or trip, because these effects last until the start of our next turn, meaning allies can take advantage of this as well. At level 13, our ancestry feat is going to be Venera Battle Clarity. So while we can act, we aren't flat-footed against hidden, undetected, or flanking creatures of our level or lower, or creatures of our level or lower using surprise attack. We really don't want to be flat-footed in this build. And we're going to be in melee, so that means flanking enemies are going to be a problem. But not with this feat. For a recommended 7th level spell, I recommend Duplicate Foe. This is technically a summon spell, and I know I said I was going to try to avoid summon spells, but like I said, at high levels, it is hard to avoid them. This spell creates a duplicate of one foe within 30 feet. Base, this spell only works on enemies that are 15th level or lower, but you can heighten the spell in order to affect higher level targets. The target can attempt a fortitude save to disrupt this spell. The duplicate appears in an adjacent space to that enemy. It has the target's stats including AC, attack modifiers, saving throw modifiers, perception, and skill modifiers. But it only has 70 hit points and lacks any special abilities that the target has, like spellcasting for instance. This also includes resistances, immunities, and weaknesses. It has no magic items except weapon potency runes. You can control it like any other minion, but it can only stride and strike. The duplicate does the same damage that the target does, but doesn't add any added effects since it doesn't have special abilities. The spell automatically ends if the duplicate's hit points reach 0. Also, the duplicate is unstable, so it takes 4d6 damage after each of its turns. Also, it's not a living creature, so it can never regain hit points in any way. As for the saving throw, if the target gets a critical success, then you fail to create the duplicate. On a successful saving throw, you create the duplicate, but it does half damage with its strikes and only can last for 2 rounds. On a failure, the duplicate functions as I described earlier. Moving on to level 14, first up is Bonded Focus. Because we have 2 focus points, because of our school spell and advanced school spell, we need to be able to get our focus points back quickly. So getting 2 focus points back whenever we refocus is very, very good. And then, from our Staff Acrobat archetype, we'll need to take Whirlwind Stance. Since we're almost always going to be wielding our staff, which we now have expert proficiency in, and our staff does have the parry trait, we can enter this stance as one action. As long as we are in this stance and don't get disarmed, which to be honest, disarm is like the worst thing you can do, we gain a +2 circumstance bonus to AC. Masquerade of Season Stance is for elemental damage, and Pirouette is for when there's only one enemy left. This feat is for when there's a whole bunch of enemies around. For an 8th level spell, at level 15, I recommend, if you have access to it, to take Summon Eerie. For 3 actions, you can cast this spell with a range of 100 feet, and it lasts until the end of your next turn. The creature you summon, yes, this is a summon spell, occupies the space of a medium creature and has a speed of 60 feet and a fly speed of 60 feet. When you cast this spell, choose whether to summon a Fate Eerie or a Fortune Eerie. If you summon a Fate Eerie, then anytime you or any of your allies within 30 feet of the Eerie roll less than a 10 on a check, you get a 10 instead. Enemies within a 30-foot emanation must make a will save. If they fail their save until the end of its next turn, anytime it rolls above a 10 for a d20 check, it gets a 10 instead. If you summon a Fortune Eerie, then you and all your allies within 30 feet roll twice and take the better result on all damage rolls, perception checks, and saving throws. Any enemies within the area must make a will saving throw. If they fail, they must roll twice and take the lower result on damage rolls, perception checks, and saving throws until the end of its next turn. Okay, we're coming to the home stretch here with level 16. And the feat I'm going to start with is Effortless Concentration. This allows us to sustain a spell as a free action when our turn begins. We're a conjuration wizard, which means we're going to have a lot of spells that need sustaining. And this will let us use that third action for something else. Again, this feat is a no-brainer for the spells. And then it's time for our third archetype, so we'll be taking the Spellmaster dedication. We gain a +2 circumstance bonus to identify magic, as long as the skill we're using is trained or better. We don't have the Wayfinder Resonance Tinkerer feats, so the rest of this doesn't apply. This is a prerequisite for other feats we're going to take later. However, being able to identify magic is very good out of combat, so we will still definitely use this. For level 17, of course, we do get our last Ancestry feat, as well as 9th level spells. For the Ancestry feat, I went with Unfettering Prankster. This allows us to cast Unfettered Pack as a Divine Innate spell once per day. For 2 actions, we can target up to 10 creatures, and this spell lasts for 1 hour. The targets don't take circumstance penalties of speed due to environmental difficult terrain, whether or not the environment is magical. They also ignore difficult terrain from such environmental properties. As a conjuration wizard, we're going to be casting spells that create difficult terrain. Thus, with this spell, these spells won't affect our allies, but will affect our enemies. This spell can definitely help the melee fighters in our party, as well as any creatures that we summon. Thus, this is a good spell that we normally wouldn't have access to. And for the recommended 9th level spell, I've gone with Upheaval. 2 actions, we can target a 150-foot burst area within 500 feet. This has 3 main effects. The first effect is that the area becomes difficult terrain. Secondly, stone pillars rise up to 60 feet tall in your chosen 10-foot squares. Each pillar stops when it hits a structure or ceiling unless that causes the structure or ceiling to collapse. The DC to climb or grab an edge is 30. Each creature on a pillar must attempt a reflex saving throw or fall off the edge, taking the appropriate fall damage. The creature can choose which edge to fall off of if multiple are equally close. A creature on a pillar that is stopped by a structure automatically falls without attempting a save. And finally, structures and ceilings might collapse. The GM rolls a flat check for the structures with a DC of his discretion. In general, shoddy structures should automatically collapse. A collapse deals 11d6 bludgeoning damage to creatures beneath it, and each creature in the collapse must make a reflex save to avoid damage. If the creature is forced to make a reflex save because it was on one of the pillars, it uses the same result. On a critical success, the target takes half the collapse damage. On a success, the creature takes half the collapse damage and is knocked prone. On a failure, the target takes the full collapse damage and is knocked prone. And finally, on a critical failure, the target takes full collapse damage and is restrained by debris until it escapes, with a DC equal to your spell DC. This is one of those great spells that does damage and can debuff foes. So if you make it this far, definitely pick this up. Alright, at level 18, our first feat is going to be Pivot Strike. For 2 actions, we can make a leap and then a strike with our staff. We deal extra damage equal to twice the number of weapon damage dice on this strike. Then, regardless of whether we hit or not, we can attempt to shove or trip the target. Then it's time for Ward Casting. As a reaction, when we use steady spell casting, we can reduce the DC from 15 to 10, making it much easier to keep our spells when people try to disrupt them. For my last recommended spell for this video, I recommend Shadow Army. Yes, this isn't a conjuration spell. However, it functions a lot like some other summon spells. For 3 actions, you can create semi-real copies of yourself in a 50-foot burst within 500 feet. You are virtually indistinguishable from your clones, allowing you to hide and sneak among them. An enemy that is within the area when the spell is cast or ends their turn in the area takes 3d10 mental damage and 3d10 bludgeoning damage. These clones can also inflict conditions depending on their will save. When you cast the spell, choose one of the following conditions for your clones to inflict on a failed save. Clumsy 2, Enfeebled 2, Flat-footed or Slowed 1. On a critical success, the target takes no damage. In addition, for the duration of the spell, that target gets 1 degree of success better on future saving throws against this spell, and can distinguish you from your clones with no difficulty. On a success, the target takes half damage. On a failure, the target takes full damage and gains the chosen condition. On a critical failure, the target takes double damage and gains the chosen condition. We are not going to be using this spell to hide or sneak. The main reason we're taking this spell is so we can combine the enfeebled, clumsy, or slowed conditions with the flat-footed condition that tripping gives us. Plus, them taking damage every turn is pretty good for us as well. And we finally get to level 20. Our ability boost for this level should be Strength, Dex, Wisdom, and Charisma. Then, for our first feat at this level, we're going to take Spell Mastery. Free spell slots For our favorite conjuration spells, no brainer. And our last feat for this build is going to be Mobile Magical Combat. For one action, if we are wielding a melee weapon and have cast a spell that requires at least 2 actions this turn, then we can stride once. If we end our movement within melee reach of an enemy, then you can make a strike against that enemy. This is just discount sudden charge, but we have to do it after we cast a spell. This is just another way to get into or out of melee combats, which for this build, we want as many ways to do that as possible. Okay, time for teamwork report number 2. Now, we definitely have enough HP and defenses to go into melee combat. And before you guys yell at me about how a bow staff shouldn't work as a magic staff, there is absolutely nothing in the rules for staffs that says that they have to be a regular staff. At least not that I can find. But if you can find a rule that says that magic staffs have to be regular staffs, then let me know in the comments. Because if that's the case, this build will not work. But otherwise, the strategy is pretty much the same as it was at level 9. Go into melee combat when the situation calls for it, trip opponents, but otherwise use your conjuration spells from afar. Especially those difficult terrain spells with unfettered pack. But don't forget to use those teleportation spells to get out of sticky situations. And don't forget to use those summon spells for flanking partners for you and the rest of your party. As well as protectors for you and those that are less melee inclined. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more Pathfinder 2e teamwork builds and other content. You can also check out the Patreon page for even more teamwork builds that aren't on this channel, as well as other amazing perks. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, teamwork is vital.